Morning, everybody, and welcome to the public assurance meeting here on Monday, the 5th of December. It's good to see everybody assembled for the last one of these of 2022. I'll come to you, Chief, to start with whether your team, whether there's any apologies, and just to introduce who you have with you today.
So the only apology is from Chris Davison. You've got myself, DCC Debenham and ACC Coulson.
Thank you very much. And then here representing the Office of Police and Crime Commissioner as myself, Marc Jones, the Police and Crime Commissioner, Malcolm Birch, the Chief Executive, and Aubrey Williams, who's here also, and also I can see that Philip Clark, the Deputy PCC, is also present. We will go straight on into the agenda. I'm just bringing the papers up. Here we are. Okay. So just by way of an update, I just really wanted to look at some reflections on the various elements that had been going on and are going on to round us into 2022, and then as we'll start into 2023. I mean, we as everybody on this meeting will know, we're in the middle of our budget setting now for 2023. As we stand, we've got 24 hours left for the public to respond to our annual crime and policing survey, where we'll gather people's views and experiences on perception and fear of crime, and also their experiences of crime and what they feel their priorities are for policing, and also their views on the financing of policing. So it's a really important time for us as we gather that information and start to go through the budget setting processes. And it's fair to say that it's an exceedingly challenging time as we approach those big decisions, both very conscious of the cost of living situation that everybody finds themselves in across the country, and obviously across Lincolnshire, and how that will affect their ability to meet their financial needs. And in the middle of that, obviously, any potential request that we might have regarding council tax. So I'll be looking very closely at the responses to the survey, and I will be led very much by the public's views on what they perceive as being the most important elements to them, be it funding of police, or indeed the prioritisation around certain service elements, which obviously I can then pass on to you. I think as well it's worth noting that there's a lot of things going on nationally which will affect us, not least of which there's a lot of work that the Home Office is now working through about what a revised offer would look like regarding the recording of crime. And I think that's a review that everybody across the country welcomes, that transparency in what is recorded and how it's recorded is really important, and making sure that it's an honest reflection of what actually is happening out there. And I know that the Police Minister is very keen to look at things such as burglary, to make sure that the statistics reflect the number of homes that are broken into, not just the amount of things categorised under burglary, which would include shed theft, garage break-ins, etc. So those kind of changes, I'm hopeful, will be coming fairly soon, which should simplify the understanding for the public, but hopefully we will get some common sense approaches to the whole recording of crime mechanism for policing, which should help lessen the burden on officers, as well as add to that transparency, which I think is a really good thing. So I think there's quite a lot of things moving around at the moment, but generally speaking, there seems to be a lot of positive movement when it comes to trying to reduce unreasonable demands and burdens upon policing from a national perspective, which I think is very welcome indeed. So that's all I would say by way of introduction on there. And I would ask Aubrey, have we got any public questions?
No, Commissioner, no public questions this time round.
Okay, so we'll move straight on then to the exception reports. Over to you, Chief.
So nothing really by exception. You've got 4 papers at the end, which will bring you up to date on those topics. The key issues for us, as you say, are the same as those you've already outlined around budget setting for the future, looking at what the impact is going to be around inflation, pay increases and so on going into 2023-24. We expect that to be a tight and difficult budget, and we are preparing accordingly, and we've previously mentioned, I think in the last one of these, around our priority based budgeting exercises to give ourselves some options should the budget not come out where we would expect it to be. Operationally, things overall are where we would expect them to be, and I'm sure Julia will pick up on some of those in terms of performance report, which is on the agenda or has been presented with the papers. We did have a couple of incidents late last week in Skegness, alongside some community tensions that had happened previously or the week before in relation to our migrant population there. These incidents were not related to that population, but we had 1 murder and 1 attempted murder. Both of those have been very, very quickly dealt with, and suspects have been arrested. I believe we are still awaiting decisions on charge for the murder, and I'll follow that up today. But actually the neighbourhood team and the area command team and everybody on the area dealt with those very, very quickly. And we've not picked up any real tensions over the weekend concerning those 2 incidents. And we're happy that there should be no further implications or threat to the public as a result of either of those. And I think that's it by exception at the moment, unless Julia has anything else she'd like to bring in.
I'm certainly happy to talk through the performance highlights, if that would be helpful.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I mean, I suppose just on some of the well, if I just get into the front, I'm not going to go through the entire report. You'll be pleased to hear probably, but very happy to have any questions around anything that's in the report. But I mean, I suppose to start with just looking at performance and looking at the exceptions. You know, one of obviously our strategic objectives is to stop crime and antisocial behaviour and to reduce crime. And you'll see from the report that crime has gone up, that we're not sort of meeting that ambition to reduce crime. And as part of the performance board, which I chair, you know, that's been a real subject of a lot of focus for us. So when we start to look at the crime recording levels and see, well, where is crime increasing? We would have expected, and we are in line with national sort of trend in terms of an increase in crime generally, and we would have expected that in comparison to lockdown and COVID. And we know we've discussed that previously in terms of some crime going back to sort of pre-COVID levels, and in some cases going back to higher than pre-COVID levels. So I just would want to assure you, we are not complacent about this in terms of accepting this increase in crime, but I do track this against the national position as well, and just to make sure, are we an outlier? And we aren't an outlier in terms of that increase in crime. When we start to look at what the increase is, a lot of it comes down to what we would call the lower level violent crime. So violent crime. So this is where you have assault with injury and assault without injury, and that makes up a significant proportion of our crime. And that makes up the significant proportion of the increase in crime. So you'll see that from the slides that is where we've had a sort of 25% increase in terms of violence with injury and without injury 21%. So starting to get into that, we've looked at that in detail in performance meeting to understand, well, what is that? So some of that is associated with domestic abuse, and some of it, as you'd appreciate, is associated with the nighttime economy. So as as premises have sort of opened up and people are out and about again, more than they were during obviously the COVID lockdown, that we've started to see this increase, which again is consistent sort of nationally. But it has taken us above where we were pre-COVID in terms of volumes. Now some of that I do anticipate is down to our crime recording and the accuracy of our crime recording. So I know, you know, through the HMIC work that actually violent crime, that their interrogation of our violent crime was done before we'd done an awful lot of interventions in terms of trying to ensure we were accurate in our crime recording. So our overall recording of crime was sort of just under 90% in terms of compliance, but violent crime was less than that. But that was taken from early in this calendar year. We've subsequently done a lot of work, and I've just asked for us, I think, just asked for a further audit to see, well, where are we in terms of compliance now? Because I suspect that we are quite a lot higher, and I do suspect that some of that increase in the lower level violent crime will be in relation to our compliance with the recording standards, which quite often mean that we will record more than one crime for an incident that's taken place that previously we know we haven't been recording. So in terms of that increase, you know, we are, you know, I had sort of detailed presentations from colleagues at the Performance Board, really happy that they are very much aware of the increases in violent crime and tackling it appropriately. You know, obviously not a surprise to us, we're coming up to Christmas. We know this is going to be a busy time of year for us. We always see an increase in violence around the Christmas period. We've got really good plans in place with our partners around licensing, around looking at hotspots, around looking at problem solving in those areas. So whilst we don't sort of welcome the increase in that low level violent crime, you know, I would sort of point out the fact that it is the low level violent crime which is being driven and is actually increasing our overall increases in crime. I'll just stop there for that the low level violent crime. If there's anything you'd like to ask me at all.
Malcolm, and then I've got Chris's hand up as well.
Great. Thanks for that, Julia. I mean, I guess through the getting past the sort of data question and the plans, I'd be interested. What do you think this means for the people of Lincolnshire in terms of their experience on the streets? And I understand you're still trying to understand what's going on, but what do you think the experience is for people on the streets of Lincoln? Do you think Lincolnshire? Do you think their experience is worse, and what can they expect from the force in terms of tackling that crime and in providing additional reassurance, I guess?
Thank you, Malcolm. I think for the people in Lincolnshire, people in Lincolnshire are safe. You know, this is a really safe county, and this is a safe place to live, work, and visit. You know, it is safe, and certainly when we start to compare ourselves across the national comparisons, you can see that we are, you know, we are, you know, a safe place. I think people in Lincolnshire can feel confident that we're going to record crime, even when it is a lower level crime. And something that they might not even recognise as a crime. So sometimes antisocial behaviour or something that, you know, they might not actually perceive as a crime, that will be recorded and that we will then investigate accordingly. So what I wouldn't want, and I'd also say, I think people in Lincolnshire can be assured that we're tackling this with partners and that we do have really effective partnerships in place, and particularly associated around the nighttime economy. You know, it's not a surprise, unfortunately, that when people do go out and have, you know, one too many pints or whatever, and alcohol is involved and everything associated with the nighttime economy, that we know that we do tend to get lower level crime and disorder associated with that, and sometimes that will be violent crime. So I think that the plans that we have with partners to tackle that are robust, and I think if I was, you know, wanting to assure the public, I'd be saying, you know, this is a safe place. So comparing ourselves nationally, we do have very low levels of crime. Some of that crime, again, is associated with the East Coast, and the influx of people, you know, during the summertime, again, won't be a surprise. But we are a safe, you know, we are a safe place to live, work and visit. We will record your crimes effectively, and we will then go and investigate it and work with partners to try to reduce the likelihood.
Thank you for that. Over to you, Chief.
Thank you, Commissioner. And just it kind of links into what Malcolm's just asked, really, is that in relation to where our crime figures have gone, there's definitely a strong correlation between the work that we've put in place to deal with crime data integrity and our crime recording standards, and that sudden uptick in the trend line, which shows a better process in terms of recording. So I don't think the overall experience has changed in terms of our communities in Lincolnshire, and it does remain a very safe place, as Julie has just said. I think the other piece we ought to reflect on, and I know this was raised at the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners Summit, is this is the first time where we are seeing a huge, not huge, but a big discrepancy in the Crime Survey of England and Wales figures and police recorded figures, where police recorded figures are above the Crime Survey of England and Wales. And that reflects the complexity of the crime data integrity and the crime recording standards, and some of being really open about this, some of the strange things that we are being asked to record as a point of crime, which I don't think the public would expect us to record, nor do chief constables across the country. I think we should be recording. So there does need to be some work done on the CDI and simplifying that 700 pages of rules that we have to follow, because I think it's overinflating some of the actual crime experiences and potentially impacting upon public confidence and public trust in policing, when actually we are still doing a very good job in responding to those crimes and dealing with the people who are causing most of that harm. So I think I'm pretty comfortable with where we're at the moment. I'm really happy with the work that Julia has got going around crime data integrity to make sure we've got that right. But I do have some concerns around crime data integrity and recording standards and how complex they are and what they mean to the public.
Thank you for that, Chief. Just before I bring Malcolm in, on the crime data integrity work that's going on, it's obviously very welcome that that's underway and that we're doing everything we can to accurately record all the incidents that should be recorded. And I share your concern that there's a big question mark over what should be recorded, why, and what we can reasonably expect the police to then do about it. I think they're big questions that we are asking nationally and we need answers to. I suppose on my reflection of that predates yourselves collectively, we've been here before. Where we had a crime data integrity inspection. We set up an independent panel to offer that reassurance to the public that Lincolnshire Police was looking at this in a not just in a compliant way, but in a sensible, common sense approach of making sure we recorded in a way that meant that we weren't missing any victims, that the core crime element was being recorded, and that if there were any auxiliary pieces that were being dealt with, that was where any additional recording might have been dealt with differently. And I suppose the question I'd have is, moving forward, given that we went through all of that and now we seem to have had to go through all of that again, what do we need to do to stay good at this, I suppose, is the question, because that's two separate times we've sort of been round and gone, wow, we're not recording these things. But somewhere in the middle it went wrong, and I appreciate it wasn't on your watch, as it were, but nevertheless you're obviously having to go back round and pick that up again, and obviously it'd be great if we don't need to do it a third time.
Yeah, so I'm conscious that Malcolm wants to come in, but I'll answer that one and then let Malcolm come back. I think the key to this is you have to commit resources to it. You have to have a sustainable team at the centre who is driving crime data integrity and our performance in this respect. That unfortunately does mean that's money that isn't spent on response policing, neighbourhood policing, crime investigation, but is spent on making sure we're compliant with that set of very complicated rules. And I do think the only way policing will survive this, if the budgets are difficult next year, is for crime data integrity to be simplified, and to trust our police officers to make the right decisions about the right crimes to investigate. And I think I've used this before, maybe not in a public meeting, but If you go to your doctor and you present with multiple symptoms, you expect the doctor to make a diagnosis and treat the main illness, not give you medication for every single symptom that you presented with. If we send police officers to crimes, I would expect them to determine what is the most serious and appropriate crime or crimes to be investigating, albeit there may be a string of other things behind it that could all factor into that investigation. But actually, let's just make sure that we have the appropriate crimes and the most serious crimes and trust our police officers' judgment to do that properly, rather than spending their time trying to think of every possible permutation of what crime has been committed or may have been committed leading up to that report coming in, and making sure that that is recorded rather than actually investigating the crime. We have to get back to that simplification and trust in our police officers to do the right thing and make the right judgment. Otherwise, this won't be sustainable in the long term.
Thank you very much for that. Malcolm.
Yeah, I think this is a helpful discussion. All I was going to add is that it's clear to me that there is an issue around crime recording, but the underlying message is that Lincolnshire remains a safe place, that policing is very active across the county. And I was just really going to add that it remains an absolutely important, strong message that the public are reporting crimes. They shouldn't be listening to this discussion thinking, oh, crikey, it's a bit confused. Actually, if there are crimes to be reported, they need to be onto the force and reporting them, whether that's in a rural location, whether that's in an urban location, whatever the nature of the crime. We can only you as a force can only respond if you know what's out there. So it's really important that people keep reporting crimes to us.
Thanks, Malcolm. Julia.
Yeah, thanks. I was just going to, and I totally agree with that message. And the only other thing I was just going to add is that where in terms of crime data integrity, I don't, the issue, and I think just to sort of be really clear, the issue isn't that we've missed victims. It's about whether we've missed out on all of the crimes associated with that individual victim. And I just think that's a really important message to send to the public, because we're not recording incidents that, against individual victims. It's actually the number of offences on the whole. It's much more likely that it's the number of offences, and that certainly was defining, I think, from HMRC when we've had their sort of recent sort of hot debrief from their visit. And I think their feedback in terms of victims and the support offered to victims was that we're performing very well, and that they were very impressed with a lot of what's in place.
No, it's a really key point, and as we've all acknowledged, this is a really complex area that's very resource heavy and isn't necessarily a victim focused national process that you're trying to follow. We're almost trying to put the victims into a national recording process, which really isn't about that. And I think that's why a lot of that simplification and clarification is needed nationally, so that we can get back to doing exactly what the Chief has suggested, which is using the ability and training of officers to be able to determine the best course of action to protect the public, rather than being tied up with over bureaucracy, which appears to be where we're at the moment. Okay, moving on then. Was there other elements that you wanted to cover, Julia?
Just wanted to cover a couple of other bits, if I may. So we know obviously our performance, and this does sort of cover one of the bits in the key areas for improvement. So we know performance around the 9 service, so the emergency service in terms of answering those calls. We know that remains very strong, and it has been consistently strong. And the reason for that is it's where we consistently prioritise, the 999 calls for emergency service. We have seen quite an increase in terms of 999 calls. We're aware of that we've had quite an upturn, but actually our performance has remained very strong in terms of answering those calls within 10 seconds. So some real good reassurance, I think, there, and certainly for the public, that if they telephone us on in an emergency situation, despite the fact that we are having more calls for emergencies, that they are going to get a very strong and effective response from us. So kind of good news there. What that does lead me on to, though, is then that our non-emergency calls for service, in terms of our telephone calls on the 101, we do recognise that that isn't where we want it to be, that we've got some challenges there just in terms of responding, answering them, you know, within the timescales that we would want to, and that we know that our abandonment rates have also increased in the 101 non-emergency domain. I mean, just to give some assurance, again, we do have alternative means of contacting, which through the single online home, which we have seen people increasingly coming into single online home and contacting us through that. But the 101 service we do recognise is still an area for concern. Now, you'll know that this is an area that we intend to invest in, that we've already put some investment in terms of resources. So frankly, we think we've just not got the numbers. And then the sort of relative stability of the 101, it has actually slightly decreased, but the relative stability, that we just don't have the numbers of people in our contact centre to provide the service that we want to be able to provide. So you'll know that we are recruiting now to deliver that uplift, and that our plan through the priority based budgeting work it is that we increase that further. So that we put additional resources in there. Now, the reality is that those resources won't be in place, but we'll start to have the initial increase in place by January. But they will need to be being trained and won't be fully operational. So I do anticipate that we'll have challenges on the 101 for the coming few weeks because of the fact of the numbers. I don't, you know, not sort of apologetic around prioritising the 9s, because that's absolutely the right thing to do in terms of risk, threat and harm. But we do recognise that 101, you know, is not where we'd like it to be. In the background, in the sort of medium term, then ACC Davison has picked up the contact management transformation piece of work. So and we'll be looking at how can we make any further efficiencies or better access for the public to access us in different ways, so that we can try to manage that demand and optimise the resources that we've got going forward. But in the first instance, it really is going to be a case of you know, putting the people in place. I do just have a little flag around that as well, just in terms of some of the impact from potentially other services. And obviously we do recognise that we're coming into a period where we're anticipating strikes and what have you. So just from a planning point of view, you know, is there likely to be any knock-on impact into policing? I suggest probably yes, but we need to be aware of that as well, and just trying to manage that the best we can. I suppose the key message really for this is we recognise the non-emergency issues that we're facing. We have got a plan to remedy that, but we'll always prioritise the 9s, and they have remained consistently strong.
Thank you for that. Chief.
Just a couple of things before we wrap up this section, and it follows on from Julia's point there about industrial action. We are planning for that, as we say. We're also expecting to be taking in Home Office prisoners at some point. So we have been put on a fairly short standby notice now around Operation Safeguard, and we know that our prison population is bursting at the seams. So we expect that there may be some flow back into police custody sites. What that means to us, we're just working through. Chris Davison has that, but it will mean that you have to have standalone custody sites to accommodate those prisoners coming in, because you can't mix your Home Office with your police prisoners that are coming in and being turned around. So because it's a completely different safeguarding requirement. So we're just waiting to see what the implications will be for that, but obviously we've got plans in place. And the final thing that I should have said, which is a good news thing in terms of exception reporting, is last week we came 36th in the top 50 most inclusive employers. There were over 1,000 applicants for that, and we've made the top 50, which is fabulous news in terms of where we are as an organisation and how people feel about working for Lincolnshire Police. But well done to Zara McCardle and the EDI team in terms of pushing that one forward as well. Mark, you're on mute.
Mark.
Thank you. And congratulations for that. But it would be useful to understand a little bit more about how you feel that work will help the organisation and ultimately the people of Lincolnshire. That would be an interesting point to discuss. So whether you wish to expand it today or at a future date, I'm relaxed. But
I'm happy to. It's and it goes back to actually the again at the APCC summit with Sarah Charman spoke about it. But this is all about our cultural push and making sure that we have a positive, happy, vibrant and productive workforce that wants to be at work, coming to work to do their best. And actually all of the kind of academic thinking on this is if you can create that environment at work, then that spills over into the service you provide, the professionalism, the courtesy, the motivation, and then that should then lead into trust and confidence. But it's that willingness and motivation to actually make Lincolnshire Police better and continually strive to make Lincolnshire Police better for the people that we serve. And I think, you know, certainly in that HMIC hot debrief that we had a week or so ago now, they picked up quite strongly on how polite, professional our officers were, how open they were, how much they were driving forward the business. So I think it has a huge impact, and it's nice that work has been reflected in this award.
Thank you. I've got a couple of other questions on the call handling piece, but I'll bring you in first, Malcolm.
Sorry, I hope I'm not cutting across you then, Commissioner. I mean, I was just going to welcome what Chris had just said, and that issue about how people feel the confidence they have in interacting with the force is really important, and part of it is what Chris has just talked about in terms of the response they get personally. I was just going to ask Julie, going back to the 101s, it's great that we're offering choice around how people access the service, you know, whether it's through online or whatever. I just wondered whether there is a sense of it's a really difficult question, so you may tell me that you don't want to answer it. Is there a sense of what proportion we should be expecting to be accessing us at this point in our development through an online route or ringing us directly?
There isn't actually, Malcolm, but I have asked for us to start looking at the single online home and the national stats and the national figures, so we can start making some comparisons. So certainly in terms of starting to look at, there's different sorts of services that people are more likely to go online for, and we know that, and we do try to actively encourage people to go online so that they're able to self-service if they possibly can. In terms of what we've got now, we know the current numbers. I've not got them in front of me. We know the current numbers that are coming through the 101, and then the people who are going online. And we can tell from people who go online if they've already tried to go on the 101 and if they've then heard our incident recording, our message saying, if you know, you can report this online, and see if they then follow that alternative route. But there isn't really a sort of national standard for how much would you expect to be reported online. We know crime wise it's around about 12% of crime that people will sort of happily report online. There are some areas which we've not as yet opened up to the public, and I've asked for us to explore how we do open that up to the public with the right safeguards in place through single online home. But there isn't really a kind of national, there's nothing to compare with as yet in terms of what do we think should be coming through that online portal. But this will be part of that will be part of that wider contact transformation plan. And obviously everything we need to do is to make sure when things are being reported on through the portal that we have our systems in place behind that to pick them up, so for instance at the moment we've not opened up the domestic abuse and serious sexual assault reporting online. Now other forces do that. We just need to make sure before we open that up that we're very confident that our resources are in place to pick those reports up and that they don't get lost. So that remains on the through traditional channels currently.
I guess just for the purposes of transparency and plain English, we talk about single online home, what the public would recognise as a website, because we very much as call this thing it's basically a website, the front of which is accessible in a standardized way, regardless of which police force you're in, and it's just branded differently, but actually it's that sort of standardized national product, hence single online home. But for all intents and purposes, it's just accessing Lincolnshire Police services by going to Lincolnshire Police website. I mentioned that purely because it would confuse most people if we weren't clear with what we meant with it. The one-on-one call handling is an interesting one, and I know it's an area that we're keen to invest in, but we're obviously through previous discussions, we're very aware of the very great level of training and demands placed upon the call handlers who work in there. It's a skilled role. It's not a straightforward role, and it takes some time, some significant time, to train people to the point where they're totally 100% proficient in that space. So as you pointed out, it's not as simple as we'll just put an advert out and employ some folk. They then need to be trained and immersed in there for quite some time before they will have all the skills needed. So I know that that is an ongoing process, but it will take some time, as you pointed out, to upskill a larger number. But it's fair to say that some of the reasoning behind this, I mean, there was the ending of the G4S contract, the bringing back in-house of the service, which has enabled you to obviously look at that afresh and actually assess exactly what there is in different departments. And as we work through some of those things, then some of the future service levels will be sort of fleshed out and then put in place. And this is a key example, I think, of where I've got good level of confidence from the conversations we've had that a plan is in place, investment is being made, and the public will see a difference. But that's a journey rather than just a switching on of a tap. So I think that's something for us to come back to into the future to sort of see how we're going on that journey. But I fully understand that's exactly what it is. The only other thing I was just going to ask you before we move off this whole space is around the response times and deployment, because obviously that links directly into the control room, but equally into the policing response side. That's something that is always a challenge across a big rural area like Lincolnshire, and it would be useful just to hear your views on where we are regarding response times and what you think is likely to happen with that in the coming weeks and months.
Okay, so in terms of our sort of we have what we set as our kind of target urgent response times, and then we also have our for the urban area, and the urban area really the way that we sort of define that is Lincoln, and then we have everything else is defined as being rural, recognising that some areas are, such as Boston and Grantham and our other towns, may also feel, that obviously they've got the urban elements to them as well. So in terms of our targets for our urgent response time, we're looking at 15 minutes for getting to an urgent response within the urban time and 20 minutes for rural. And we are hitting those targets, meeting those targets in about 2/3 of cases for the time being. So actually really quite strong performance, and obviously drilling down into where we're then not meeting that target and looking at, well, why was that? Once an incident has been defined as an incident, it then doesn't change its definition, so as it or its response requirement. So there may be some very legitimate reasons why we don't then end up responding to something within that time scale. But actually 2/3 of attendance we are meeting within those time scales. We do have some areas where we're not meeting, and obviously we'd want it to be more than that, but I think in reality it can't be 100%. It can't be 100% because we know we've not got the resources, and also because some incidents will change as they, as the incident develops. We have got other areas where we're not quite meeting that level of performance, and we're just doing some sort of deep diving into that to understand, well, Is it where we've got, as you'll know, we've got a number of new officers? Are our officers trained with the right driving skills? So just looking at checking across those areas, and the geography in some areas. So the Wolds is an example where we know we have some difficulty with geography, because of the size of the area. Come January, some of our we're sort of implementing a new shift pattern, and we're implementing a new resourcing model for investigations. And the intention behind that, some of the intention behind that is that we do free up some capacity, and that will then improve those response times further. So that all comes in from the start of January, and my expectation is that should free some resource up, and that we should have, our capability will be, our response times will improve further. That said, I do put the caveat around that of potentially further. We do know that in some of our more remote areas, they are, and even on the East Coast, if somebody needs to take a mental health detained person in to hospital, then it's a further trip for them, and it's a time issue. If we end up having to use a custody suite or having different custody suites because we've got Operation Safeguard, then that might have some travelling impact for us. So I think there are some things currently kind of developing and outside of our control that could still play into that response, but on the whole, I think our response has stood up well, and should even actually improve when we get our new model in place in the new year.
Thank you for that, Chief.
Yeah, thank you. I think the other thing to remember as well is that there's a balance to be had here between just reacting and actually putting resources into the proactive element of it to deter criminals and reduce our demand and reduce crime in the county. So there's been some really successful things happening recently. Road policing unit are being very successful around tackling some of our criminals who are using the roads. We've had real success with the rural crime team over the past couple of weeks. So I think in the last 2 or 3 weeks they've made 27 arrests, seized multiple vehicles, multiple dogs, seized lots and lots of equipment that's being used for that. And actually, if you look at our hare coursing and that kind of demand, that's gone from 400 plus incidents a month a year or so ago to around about 75 to 100. I know that's still a lot, but it's still a significant drop, and actually quite often those incidents are the same people moving from field to field to try and escape the police. So we get multiple calls on the same day relating to the same people. So they've been really successful. I was out with the road policing unit last week just checking on how intelligence is being fed through to them and whether they're being properly tasked. They are. We've now got armed policing units who are going out with clear problem profiles and person profiles. So those people who are causing us most harm to target. The road policing unit are doing the same, tactical support team are doing the same, rural crime team are doing the same, and the 2 proactive teams on the areas are also getting those intelligence packages through. So hopefully by having that collective targeted proactive approach, we will start to see some of the demand coming down, which also then means that our response times to those reactive elements coming in should also start to improve, because we give our officers a bit more time and space to do it.
No, that's great. And if you can emulate what's happening with the rural team across crime, then we'll see crime drop by 3/4. So what's not to like about that?
Yeah, there's a lot there to start with, but we're getting there. We'll see what we can do.
But no, I mean, that is a really good result, and as we've highlighted before, and the force has been delivering. The hard bit is definitely tackling the criminality. The slightly easier, but nevertheless sometimes quite difficult bit, is making sure the public know that you've done it. And I know that messaging is getting out there now and is really welcomed by the rural community, particularly around the rural crime work. I've had numerous messages from different elements of the community just saying what a great job Lincolnshire Police are doing, and quite simply they just wouldn't know that if they weren't getting those messages. So that's great to see as well, because it really does offer people that assurance, particularly if they live in isolated locations, knowing that that work is ongoing and it is making a real difference. So you know, thanks for not just for doing the one side, but getting both of those up and running. I know it is making a difference for everybody. Okay, we will move on then. So we, unless there's anything else somebody wishes to cover, we'll move on to item 6, key areas for improvement. So back over to you, Chief.
Yeah, and I'll rapidly hand over to the DCC because she owns HMIC FRFs and all the activity that sits around that.
So I just wonder whether we've almost covered that actually, because the key areas for improvement, I think we've got remaining crime types, the reduction in crime, and then contact management. So I'm not trying, I'm just trying to pull the agenda up because my screen's gone. I just wonder if there was anything specific that anything else you wanted to add or ask me.
Well, I suppose it just linking into this, it's about, I suppose, slightly broader, but fitting exactly to this. So I'm being sort of opportunistic, really. It's just to make sure I'm confident that there will be a range of products available that we provide our community-based officers, whether they're neighbourhood policing, PCSOs, that we push out regarding crime prevention to help people protect themselves as much as anything, to avoid them being victims of crime, and equally to make sure people understand the different ways of contacting the police. So as you pointed out, through the website is a key one, where actually if people don't know about it, how do they switch from what they would traditionally do to that? And I guess it would be useful at some point to understand what the approach is regarding that. So I'm not sort of asking you to go into detail here today, but certainly I'm interested in, is there a standardized set of products that we put out across the county? So if I go and stand in a market square with a PCSO in Boston and Gainsborough, have they both got similar kind of literature? Is it all done very locally? Is it centralized? Because I'm just not clear if there's a centralized strategy around some of those things, and I just wonder if there's more we can do to support those neighbourhood officers who are trying to deal with the sharp end of prevention around fraud, scams, everything else. So that's something you may have an instant answer, but I'm not asking you to have. But it's something that has come up in recent weeks where people have been sort of saying to me, you know, what they do have, don't have. And I thought, well, I will ask that question because I think it'd be worth us coming back to at least at some point at a future meeting, explain what the strategy and plan is around that, how we keep communities safe.
So I know certainly in terms of neighbourhood policing, we've just had the peer review of neighbourhood policing, which has come out very with some really good feedback around that. So I think that was, not sure if it was Nottinghamshire that did that peer review, but in terms of the standardised products, I mean, Di, I'm not suggesting whether we've got that, if you've got that answer now, but is that something that's part of you've obviously got the Police and Partnership Board and delivering those products to neighbourhood officers. And I would actually have it wider than just the neighbourhood officers, to be honest, because I think it's for everybody going out there. You know, certainly our focus on prevention, and when we are linked into that the national development of prevention, focus on the prevention and problem solving is something that I know Di is certainly very keen on through her strategic leadership of that board. So Di, I don't think there's anything else you'd want to add to that now.
Yeah, certainly. So I think, as you'll be aware, we're refocusing the Communities and Partnerships Board, and one of the key areas for that is around prevention and making sure that that is streamed across all our areas of policing and that we're using all our opportunities to prevent crime. Certainly you reference fraud and scams, and I know we've got a report around fraud and scams, so we do have centralised literature certainly around those areas, and I'll touch more on that when we come to that particular report. But yeah, in terms of the wider prevention piece, one of the things that we're really keen to move forward within the board is to make sure that we are delivering and maximising the opportunities for people to prevent crime and prevent themselves becoming victims of crime, looking at both the victim side and the perpetrator side.
Thanks for that. I'm just aware that the Safer Together team often are standing shoulder to shoulder with some of the PCSOs in different locations doing community work, and it's notable that they often turn up and they don't have anything with them. So that if it does exist, it's obviously somewhere not quite joining up as a system. So I don't know what they should have, whether there is a standardized centralized product, but certainly I think that's something that hopefully you'll be able to address through that board. Malcolm?
I've got a separate point if that one
Yep.
is still
Happy
running.
to take it.
Okay, I was just going to, I mean, we've heard a lot today that's very helpful around our response time, our understanding our communities, moving into prevention, the direction of travel of the overall crime figures. I just wanted to take us back briefly, for me, which is another really important thing from the public point of view, is about how we're solving those crimes that were actually being reported to us. Now, we kind of in the jargon talk about outcomes, and that's the number that sort of buzzed around in terms of statistics, but it is about, you know, if you remember the public report of crime, well, what happens? And I'm conscious there's some work going on in this area as well to really address this issue of when we reported a crime, investigating it and getting a good outcome, i.e. catching somebody or resolving it. And I just wondered whether I don't know whether it's the chief or the deputy chief constable would have a view around our direction of travel in relation to solving crime and what we're expecting going forward.
I'm happy to come in there if the chief is happy.
You beat me to the mute button, Julia, so carry on if you wish to. I can always add at the end if necessary.
Yeah, okay. So outcomes are, I mean, I totally, you know, thank you for the question. I totally agree. It's really important that, you know, when we're talking about incidents and we're talking about crime, but actually what we're talking about is people here, and people, you know, that are victims who we are totally committed to doing the very best for and giving them the very best service. And again, I am kind of reassured or heartened by some of the feedback we've had from the HMRC, just in terms of the referrals that we're making for victims and the quality of service that we give them. That said, I do think that outcomes through the performance meeting that I chair, as you know, is an area that I think we need to make some improvements in. So some of this is where we've got, again, the increase in crime. So because we've got an increased volume of crime, then and particularly where these are offences that you have, you know, many offences associated to one crime, the outcomes that because the crime's gone up, then outcomes correspondingly have actually reduced. And I do think this is an area that we need to put some more focus on. So I've asked for the head of crime just to develop a plan so that we can really make sure that we are achieving outcomes in all those cases and appropriate outcomes in all those cases. Now, I know later on that we'll be talking about the criminal justice report, and some of those cases are actually where we want to make sure that we're using outcomes for serious offences, that we're, you know, relentlessly pursuing those perpetrators. Our changes to our investigative model that come in January, I think, will make us better placed to do that, using the best resource to tackle each of the crime types there, in terms of getting crimes to court and offenders to court where that's appropriate, but also that we make best use of our out-of-court disposals. And I think that's an area where we do have opportunities, and you'll be aware the new out-of-court disposal framework comes in April, and we've got a lot of work ongoing now to make sure we're really fit for purpose, and that we're ready to use those new disposals and those diversionary disposals for people who don't need to be going to court. So I think outcomes is an area that we do want to see an improvement in terms of the volume of outcomes that we're getting, you know, because that means victims who are getting a proper outcome for the offence for which they're a victim of. That our investigative model will, you know, we've remained fairly sort of steady in terms of our positive outcomes for prosecutions. But actually the out-of-court disposals as well, that we need to make sure we're making really good use of those those disposals that are available to us, so that offenders are brought to justice in an appropriate way.
Thank you for that. Did you want to come back, Malcolm?
I was just going to say that thank you for that, because I know, Commissioner, you've questioned a lot around how we're solving crime, and it's good to hear that from the Deputy Chief Constable in terms of our plans. And also just to clarify, I think what you meant, our proportion of outcomes in relation to crime was I think was the issue. I think there's still quite a lot of crimes getting solved. It's just as crime goes up, it's that proportion and that issue around data. But it's an important area, because it's about justice, isn't it? And that's why the public, you report something, you want justice. You often, people report things because they want to see something resolved out of it, because it's just the right thing to do, really.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chief.
Yeah, just supporting what Malcolm said, it is about justice, and I think it's important that actually we make sure we're tackling all elements of our demand and our investigation and our crime outcomes, because fundamentally our true success should always be about the absence of crime, not the solving of crime. But where it does happen, we've got to be giving an effective service. I think previously what we've had is a kind of cultural approach where it's just been react and allow the demand to almost swamp us. So we've had no breathing space and no time to actually deal with the investigation in the way that we would want to. I think we're getting on top of that now with the demand elements that we've been speaking about, and the work that Julia has just described in terms of our proportionate crime investigation and the crime standards and crime outcomes piece of work that's going on, and just making sure that we give our officers and our investigators as much help and as much space and time as we possibly can to make sure that we do deliver that justice.
Thank you. I know the out of court disposal work sort of has been delayed a little bit. It's sort of the timescale, I suppose, is collapsing. We're sort of getting close to when it needs to be in. Have we got a good level of confidence that work's going at the right pace to sort of meet the deadline?
Yeah, I think so. And the paper that's at the end covers that piece as well, the paper from Liz Rogers. So I think it's April next year that it all goes live. There's been a lot of work to prepare us for that. It's not been easy, but we're ready for that to come through. So I'd say we're in a pretty good state of assurance around that at the moment, and actually Liz and her team have done a phenomenal amount of work to make sure we get there.
That's good. I did hear, I can't remember where or by who, but it was a credible place and person that might actually slip to later in the year from April. But I guess the thing to do is to be confident about April, and then if it does move back to the autumn, we'll be in the right place for it. Good stuff. Okay, moving on then. So item 7, over to the priority update.
Sorry, I'm bouncing around between screens now trying to get those up. So I've lost my agenda. What order are we in? So
partnerships first.
Partnership working. So I think Di is going to cover this one. The criminal justice one and economic crime I'll cover, and then I think Di is back on the fraud and scams. So Di, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So you'll see that the paper is focused mostly around some of the work that we're doing with our Safer Lincolnshire partnership, which is our county-wide community safety partnership, but accepting that we have very strong partnership relationships in a whole host of areas, but we'll focus on those for today. I don't propose to read out the paper or go through every line in it, but just to kind of highlight some of the key points if I may. So as I said, it focuses around the Safer Lincolnshire partnership work and the priorities that have been agreed with that group, and they are around reducing fraud victimisation, targeted prevention work around longer term neighbourhood and antisocial behaviour issues, providing alternative to criminal justice outcomes for people that are in the transition years, so those 18 to 25-year-olds, which are an area that tend to be neglected in that kind of gap between being considered a child and then into adulthood. Making sure that we've got services available for drug and alcohol abuse, and also some focused work around drug-related deaths and how to reduce those. And then also using the evidence and the partnership data so that we can target those areas of the greatest deprivation, which we know are linked to higher levels of being either a victim of crime or a perpetrator of crime. So a couple of bits to focus on in terms of some of the activity that's been going on most recently. So one of the areas that we are incredibly proud of is the work that we do within the Stay Safe Partnership, working alongside colleagues in Lincolnshire County Council and Lincolnshire Fire and Rescue, and also colleagues within We Are With You around the work they do for drug and alcohol. So what they've done recently is developed their offering so that we can get inputs into mainstream education settings for Key Stage 1 and 2. So those age groups are between 5 and 7 for Key Stage 1 and 7 and 11 for Key Stage 2. And they deliver a whole range of packages which are clearly age appropriate, but are designed to provide some of that prevention work. And we know that research says that actually to really develop that prevention work and get those messages in, we need to be targeting that primary school age. So we are kind of in line with that evidence base and trying to get those messages in. And on a positive note, we will make sure that every child in education gets at least one input from the education team. Now, we also deliver into other educational settings, so those with additional needs, behavioural units, home education groups, and also we're able to deliver to one-to-one sessions for those children that have been excluded. So we recognise that not everybody is in mainstream education, but the important thing is we're getting those messages out to all the young people in the county. So I think from a prevention point of view and that kind of generational change point of view, I think that's a really key area for us. So if I move on then just in relation to our licensing team, so they work very closely with immigration and with trade and standards, and you'll see from the report have done a number of joint operations which have led to the seizure of huge amounts of illicit tobacco products. They've also done work around temporary event notices, obviously since all the issues we've had through COVID, and now that society is opening back up again and there's a desire for temporary event notices, they've done all the research around those to make sure those events can take place safely. Obviously all of that impacting on the economy, so we want to support people where we can to have those events. And also they continue to do their work around our licensed premises, making sure those checks are done, the reviews are done to make sure that they're complying with the right standards there. And then just in relation to the integrated offender management team, I think one of the most significant areas that they're working on supports really strongly the work of the Safer Lincolnshire Partnership around reducing reoffending, which is focusing on that, providing that alternative or interventions for those people who commit repeat offences in that transition age period, so making sure that we've got that support going into those people to try and deter them from continuing to commit those offences. And then looking forward for the next 12 months, obviously the Stay Safe team are going to be looking at evaluating the work that they do, but also whilst they're there delivering those inputs is actually getting some feedback in relation to the issues that are concerning those young people and the issues in their community, because that will then help us to develop and tailor the inputs to the right areas and to deliver inputs around the right concerns. And we have recently taken on an educational coordinator to focus around delivering inputs around violence against women and girls and how to work on prevention in relation to that. So that piece of work is being developed and the content being pulled together. So that should start to see delivery in the near future. And then in terms of the integrated offender management team, again, they're looking at how they're going to bring on board a cohort of offenders in relation to high-risk domestic abuse perpetrators to make sure that we are actually targeting those within that sphere as well to try and prevent those repeat offences. So I think in summary, accepting, as I've said, that we have lots of partnership work ongoing in a whole host of areas, what I think is clear is that we do have really strong relationships with our partners across the county, and are joined up around the strategic objectives and what we want to deliver. So I'll pause there if there's any questions.
Thank you. I've got a couple just about wider partnerships. Really, what you've said was very clear. I mean, if you could give me a little bit more about the partnerships in the space around trying to reduce serious violence and violence against women and girls, because I know there's a lot of partnership work going on there. That'd be really helpful just to frame that. And also what impact partnership working is having on mental health incidents, if it is, because I know obviously for some time we've had a mental health practitioner working out of the force control room, and I know at times it's not always been recruited to through nobody's fault. It's just needing to obviously recruit to the right specification, etc. Because I remember receiving data on the year one data for that post and the impact it had, which was significant, the value it had added, but I don't know whether we've got any later data than that. And again, linking to that around the mental health triage car, whether what impact that has had, etc. So again, if you've not got all of those bits and bobs to hand, then it would just be useful to look at that moving forward, just so that I can understand those investments we're making in that space, which arguably are investments in other people's services, trying to reduce demand upon policing, but in that partnership space, that would be really helpful. And obviously, just while we're talking around mental health, obviously we know that there's a lot of work going on nationally to look at that. I've got a round table with the minister next week on mental health with some other with National Police Chiefs Council and College of Policing and others. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. But I know that there's some learning coming out of what Humberside have been doing, and I know that we've been looking at some of that. So anything you can tell me about the mental health situation would be welcome.
Okay, so if I start with your first questions first, so just in relation to what we're doing around serious violence and the violence against women and girls. So obviously we have a new serious violence duty that's on its way, and we have actually recognised that serious violence is an issue, and we need to tackle that across the partnership space. So over the last 6 months, there's been some work ongoing with the Safe Lincolnshire Partnership and through the OPCC's office, and there has now been a core priority group set up to tackle and reduce serious violence across the county and with partners. Now, where that has progressed to is we have had a consultant that's come in, and public health consultant that's come in and actually done a needs assessment for the county around serious violence. That's been presented to partners, and a strategy has been developed from that, and we are now working through the various elements of that strategy to develop a delivery plan so that we can start to turn some of this into action. Some of the information won't come as a surprise in terms of some of the key areas where we're most vulnerable around serious violence, around areas of deprivation. We recognise that we need to have all partners working together in a whole system approach to be able to tackle it. It's not just a policing issue, it's an issue that faces a lot of our partners, and we need to come together to tackle that. And the violence against women and girls, we're obviously closely linked into the national work around that. And Sarah Norburn has been working as part of that national group for the last 6 to 12 months, supporting that as well, and she's supporting us in force as well in developing that. And actually we've invested in a superintendent to lead that piece of work, recognising how important that is to the public. So that work is well in train. We have a partnership group set up to deliver on the violence against women and girls, which feeds in and links to the serious violence core priority group, because we recognise those issues go hand in hand. So we're starting to really start to deliver some of that work, and I think probably some of the key points around that is the Safer Streets piece of work, which I know has been pushed out and promoted strongly, and actually we're really starting to see some positive results from that in terms of people feeling confident to report where they don't feel safe, and we're able to then coordinate that information and share that with partners to actually put measures in place to make those areas safer for people. So I'll just pause there. Is there anything further you want to ask in relation to the violence piece?
Nothing else from me. I'm seeing no other hands, so no, that's all good. Thank you.
Okay. So just in relation to the mental health side of things, so you'll be aware that ACC Davison has had a strong lead in mental health for quite some time. So whilst I don't have the data for the FCR practitioner or the triage car, I do know that there have been difficulties, as you rightly pointed out, in terms of recruiting to some of those posts. But equally, I also know from colleagues that there is a huge value in having those posts in place and recognising that we're investing in other services. We also know that we have invest a significant amount of police officer time in dealing with mental health patients. Some of that is unavoidable because that's what the legislation dictates that we must do, but we're also really keen to learn from other areas. So looking at the Humberside model to see how they tackle these issues is really important to us. And within the Communities and Partnerships Board, there are going to be a number of partnership areas that we're going to focus on. And I think one of those areas will be mental health. And I know Chris is setting up a working group to develop an overall strategy about how we can tackle mental health issues that we come across, accepting that obviously there's a space for health colleagues to deal with that. And what we want to do is get to a point where we can prevent people getting to that crisis point and therefore we then become involved due to the legislation side of things. So it's really important for us to work with colleagues in health to make sure that prevention can take place. But actually we also recognise we need to look at what measures we're doing at the moment and what learning we can take from other areas and other forces to try and maximise the time that we're spending dealing with crime prevention and responding to policing incidents, and minimise the time that we're having to look after people who are in mental health crisis or struggling, because actually we're not best placed or best trained to deal with people in that position. So can happily provide some further information in due course in relation to the data, but hopefully that gives you a feel for kind of the direction of travel that we're taking on that.
It does, and obviously I'm very keen to help appropriately manage that demand, and if there's anything I can do in the partnership space with that, I'm very keen to assist. I know colleagues in health are working particularly hard trying to manage their demand, so I know that they're not just sitting back and letting the police pick up the pieces. That's not what I'm saying. I know that the system in Lincolnshire is very, very busy. However, we've got to try and get each element working as well as it can on the bits that only they can do well, and clearly people in mental health crisis are best served by a health response rather than a policing one. I don't think anybody would deny that, not least of which the £150 million that's been invested nationally just to provide mental health transportation. I'm unaware that there is any bespoke mental health transportation for Lincolnshire, so I'm interested to understand what Lincoln's proportion of that £150 million that was ring-fenced specifically for that was, and indeed when we can look forward to seeing that actually happen, so that we're not using police officers and police vehicles to transport people in crisis to places of safety. So I think there are some things that we can still work on that, and again there'll be things I'll be raising next week. I think one of the other challenges around this is obviously where you have people, and I'm aware of incidents very recently where clearly people are putting themselves in danger to try and get help and support for mental health issues, and it's resulting in huge amounts of police time and call out, and it must be, aside from the fact that it's very frustrating for officers to be called to exactly the same location to deal with exactly the same person in the same crisis day after day after day, it clearly must be very mentally draining for the officers trying to deal with those kind of incidents as well. So I think we do need to sort of work with partners as well as we can to try and get some of that change that we all need for our residents. So anything I can do to help there, I'm obviously keen to. Julia.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, just to add to that, I'm sort of engaged with the Health and Wellbeing Board. I think the next meeting is tomorrow, actually, where I'm discussing with health colleagues there just in terms of the issues. And I know that's really, really tricky, tricky problems, and everybody's resources are stretched. And I do understand that. Some of the work that I've done through the Performance Board, and I am waiting for something specific to come back around the mental health to help to inform this picture, but is to start to understand, it goes back to that incident response piece of work, start to understand what we're not going to, and to try to give us a little bit of a flavour of that and a narrative of that, because there's some of the difficult conversations that we're going to have about sometimes we don't get to incidents because we're perhaps looking after somebody who's got who could more productively be being looked after by mental health professionals, and the long and short of it is there's no other service that doesn't go to our incidents. But if we can't get to an incident, there's no other service that will kind of go on our behalf. So doing some work so that we can properly understand that and share that with partners, to sort of help them understand the issues that we're facing.
I fully support that. Slightly wider question. Do we think that the force is achieving its partnership priorities? Do you have sort of clear, this is what we want to achieve from our partnerships, and we're comfortable that we're getting that, or we're on track to get that?
Yeah. So did you want me to? I know Chris, you look like you're about to speak.
No, go on, Di. You go. I was just going to say that this is something Di worked on prior to coming into the chief officer team. Martin Parker now has working with the council, and in that dedicated post we have around setting our strategy, making sure that we are linked in where we should be. I think we're in a pretty positive place. I think that was recognised by HMIC FRS when they came in. I do think there's more we can do around the joint strategic needs assessment, and HMIC picked that up as well. Di knows that. Di was heavily involved in that, so heavily invested in making sure we do something with it in the future as well, because it is an amazing database and piece of knowledge that should be driving a lot of our business with our partnerships. So I think we're on the right track. I think there's an awful lot of good there. I still think there's more we can do, and I'm sure that's where Di is going to take us now.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think it's important to note that joint strategic needs assessment was a phenomenal piece of work, and actually has already led to the setting of the priorities for the Safer Lincolnshire Partnership, to which everybody's signed up, and those delivery plans are now developed. So we are actively working towards those agreed priorities, and I think what's really important is that that's across a strategic level, and obviously the political element of the local councils that are involved across all the districts, because we recognise that this partnership and these objectives serves 7 different districts within the county. So it's really important to get everybody to agree and work towards those with our partners. And I think the other thing I would say is that it goes beyond just the Safer Lincolnshire Partnership, because certainly whilst I was within the county council post, we did an awful lot of work with the Domestic Abuse Partnership, the Children's Safeguarding Partnership, and the Adult Safeguarding Board, to make sure that with those 4 effective safeguarding boards, because we're all focused on prevention and community safety in one guise or another, that we were actually, where we could, we were joined up across the partnerships to make sure that we weren't duplicating work, and that actually what we were doing was complementing each other and pooling resources where it was appropriate. And I think just moving on from that, certainly I know that Martin Parker, who is in that role at the moment, chaired a partnership conference day, I think it was towards the end of September, to actually bring everybody together to develop how we could continue to work closely together, and support each other, which went a little bit beyond some of the Safer Lincolnshire Partnership group, but actually pulling together that wider partnership and making sure that not just in terms of strategy, objectives and delivery groups, but in terms of actual day-to-day working, where we could work better together, that we were doing that. So I think that day was really important in terms of kind of resetting and making sure that everybody was signed up to working together, accepting that we are facing some difficult financial times, but recognising that actually we need to pull together, not pull apart with those, and we can achieve a lot more together. So I think that was a very long answer to your question, in that I think we are certainly working towards those joint objectives.
Thank you for that. If there's nothing else, then I would propose we move on to the economic crime paper.
You're on mute, Chris.
So yeah, sorry, is it criminal justice one next or economic crime? I've got, I don't mind what order.
Well, I've got it as being economic crime, fraud and scams, then the CJ. But I genuinely,
okay.
whatever order you wish to deliver them in is fine by me.
Right. Okay. Let me go to economic crime then. I get the right paper open. So, so economic crime wise, I won't read the whole paper out, but this settles into financial investigation, Proceeds of Crime Act, confiscation and civil recovery elements. So it's a range of investigation to disruption activity that the team is involved in. But where confiscation orders are made after conviction, it goes without saying really that it does depend on the conviction rate. So back to the conversation we had earlier, those criminal justice outcomes are really important in terms of use of some of the powers within this team to make sure that we can tackle the assets and try and seize and freeze assets where we need, where we've got the powers to do so. So it does kind of link in with everything else that we've been speaking about. Key part of the POCA, so the Proceeds of Crime Act, is part 5, which is really about the identification and seizure of cash that's £1,000 or more, and valuable items that are seized by officers during search and search warrants or similar powers. Initially, they're seized under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act as evidence of criminality. But obviously, if that doesn't proceed, then the Economic Crime Unit can look at forfeitures outside of that and use of civil powers under POCA, based on which would then mean that we're looking at the balance of probability rather than beyond reasonable doubt. In terms of account freezing orders, and we'll come to some of the figures in a moment, they work in a very similar way under Part 5 orders, but it does allow us to freeze bank accounts where it can be shown that the funds on the balance of probability are the proceeds of criminal activity. So that's a very useful tool in terms of making sure that criminals are unable to continue drawing down their funds whilst we investigate or move towards prosecutions and thereafter. And occasionally, if those two orders don't work, then we can look for deprivation orders, which allow us to make sure that funds aren't returned to defendants, and those are mainly used for forfeiture under the Misuse of Drugs Act. So there's a range of things that we can be doing here in terms of taking away the assets and the ill-gotten gains of those who are involved in criminal activity. As you'll be aware, Commissioner, the funds are normally collected by His Majesty's Courts and Tribunals Service, who will then make sure that the proceeds of that are paid out quite often to the victims of the offence, and make sure that the balance of the funds are then distributed accordingly. And they're broadly shared between Home Office, Law Enforcement, Crown Prosecution Service, using the Asset Recovery Incentivisation Scheme, or ARIS as everybody refers to it. And the share that's made available to policing is just 18.75% of that, less a small percentage taken as a top slice to fund national projects. So it comes in just under that 18.75%. We do recognise that denying assets to criminals is a significant tactic, and obviously some of that money comes back in through the ARIS scheme to the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner, and then onward into terms of paying for services to our victims, or in terms of strengthening our economic crime unit, as well as you have done over the past year or so. And then the last piece really that the team will also look at is money laundering, and that's where criminals are trying to hide their ill-gotten gains and turn it into legitimate money. And as we'll hear a little bit later, that's becoming increasingly complex with cyber and cryptocurrency. But we do also look at encouraging and promoting the use of all that legislation across all of the work streams to try and tackle money laundering. So key bits for this paper, though, are the results over the last 12 months. So we haven't used the normal financial reporting year. So this is November 2021 to the end of October. So you can see confiscation orders there, total value of just over 809,000, but the benefits identified around 48 million. And then you've got POCA orders under Part 5 of nearly 85,000. And then in terms of ARIS funding claims there, somewhere in the region of 460,000, 470,000 if you total all those up. That's my mental arithmetic going horribly awry there, slightly above there. So some really powerful numbers there, and just how much that can be seized, forfeited and redistributed if we keep investing in this team. In terms of the future, what we've got is the Economic Crime Act for 2022 and the Economic Crime Bill, which received royal assent earlier this year. That really came in because of the Russian situation and fast-tracking financial sanctions against Russian oligarchs, and then further financial reforms are following, including a reform of Companies House that will give us powers to challenge false and inaccurate information through Companies House and share more information with law enforcement, which should really help the activities in this field. There'll also be a second bill that brings in new powers to seize crypto assets and enhance that anti-money laundering process. And just taking account of where this is all going really in terms of that online investment and cyber element to it. But that will bring with it more demand, more assessments, and will put the team under real pressure, particularly as our organised crime groups start to move into this area, which seems to be a bit more secure for them as well. And therefore we need to make sure that we have the technological advancements and skills to deal with that and to deal with those advancements that will be coming in the criminal world as well. So the Treasury has announced that they will be regulating some cryptocurrencies. The first one that they've named is stable coins. So we actually get into a recognised form of payment and a regulated currency online. Again, we'll wait and see what that means to us in terms of demand and the skills that are required for it. But amongst all of this, cash still remains the preferred method for many involved in the criminal market, particularly drug dealers, and it still offers real opportunity for us to seize assets and seize cash, because that money at some point has to be put through financial institutions to be laundered effectively. So we'll continue to push any opportunities around cash and money laundering and those investigations. The risks that are presented really is that the developing technology and, as I say, the cryptocurrency element creates more and more complexity, more and more technological challenges, and will probably put more and more demand onto the team. But nevertheless, we'll continue to relentlessly pursue those organised criminals, including the drug dealers, fraudsters and thieves, and try and make sure that they're unable to benefit from their offending, because at the end of the day, it is the assets, the money, that's the lifeblood of all organisations, whether criminal or otherwise. And if we can take that lifeblood away from our criminals, then hopefully we can stop them causing people harm. And that, I think, is a very quick trot through the paper.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a really good thing to take money from criminals, in the sense that most criminal acts obviously take place because they want to make money. So if that money is then denied them, then clearly that's a very good tool at the disposal. And it's absolutely right, the victims of those crimes, you know, are considered
So I'd have to go back and check the precise detail on what actually comes back, but there is different. There are different options under the Misuse of Drugs Act in terms of that. It still really is a matter of using POCA and those other options wherever they're most effective. So I'd have to come back to you on the precise detail of that, Commissioner.
No, that's fine. It's just my understanding was that under the drugs legislation specific to drugs, tackling drugs, there was a much more I'll call it progressive process of recovering the funds, because it goes straight back into fighting criminality. So it comes to law enforcement rather than going through the standardized POCA process, I understand. So it would be good to find out if that is if I'm right, and also if that is a route that we're using and maximising, because obviously we want to be maximising the routes that bring the most criminal money back through law enforcement to then tackle more criminality. So that would be useful to look at. Malcolm.
Sorry, I was listening carefully, but I'm not sure I heard it. Did we also talk about unexplained wealth orders? Because I'd be interested to know how they're playing out. Because 2 or 3 years ago they were sort of tirade as a major thing. And my understanding, in layman's term, is that if you've got money and you can't explain how you've got it, there's the ability to take it off you. Are we pursuing that actively as well against criminals?
We do pursue that actively, but a lot of that activity actually happens in EMSU, in the East Midlands Special Ops Unit, around unexplained wealth, and tends to target the higher end organised crime groups. But it is still something that's there and available to us. There's obviously a lot of work goes into it, so there needs to be that kind of value for money and return on your investment around that. But there's key partnerships with Inland Revenue, HMRC, around this as well, because not only is the unexplained wealth element there, and then the ability to asset and take those assets away, but there's also a huge tax implication. And actually some of the tax powers are probably more effective in this field than some of the criminal asset recovery powers.
Thanks.
Okay. Well, we will move on then to the whichever of the final two you wish to go to.
We'll go to the criminal justice one then, I think. So just bear with me while I get that one open. So again, very quick trot through this one rather than reading the whole paper, because it is there for people to read. But criminal justice, as you're probably well aware, is effectively 4 teams. You've got prosecutions, traffic, witness care and evidence management, and the latter includes our identification unit. But we also then have the custody function across 4 custody suites in the county. And as you know, the custody function transitioned recently from G4S to Mighty for care and custody, and we work very closely with the Crown Prosecution Service and His Majesty's Courts and Tribunal Service as well. So there's been a lot going on actually in this field because of that transition from G4S and bringing those services back in-house apart from the custody element. Those changes have gone very well. There's still a lot of work to do in terms of harmonisation of terms and conditions and making sure that we remove what duplication there is and establish new ways of working. But Becky Talbot-Young and her team are working very hard on that and have presented options to us and continue to do so. Up until August this year, CJS was part of the East Midlands Criminal Justice Service collaboration. That's now being collapsed down, and we're currently just looking at our options and building a partnership really with Leicestershire. That looks like it will provide good value for money, making sure that we don't have to establish two separate teams for the two forces. There are established ways of working already because Leicestershire provided the core team for EMCJS. So we're basically thinning that down and making it work for the two forces rather than five forces. In terms of what's coming, Bail Act, which came through October 2022, is likely to reduce the number of defendants that are released under investigation. This, from a policing point of view, has been a really positive step. I think most are probably satisfied that RUI really didn't work. It didn't offer the control that you would want over some of our most harmful offenders, nor did it offer the protection for those who are being abused or subject to domestic abuse and so on and so forth. So we think this has been a really good change in direction and adjustment, moving away and giving us more options around bail again. The Director's Guidance 6, DG6, as it's generally referred to in the Attorney General Guidance 2022, have had a huge impact on police officers and the criminal justice system as a whole, but mainly on our police officers. And the introduction of an increased requirement for redaction and file compliance at the pre-charge stage means that we're having to do more and more and more work just to get to a charging decision, and almost having to get files to a point where they are trial ready before we can even get a charge decision from the CPS. And that's a huge amount of work, again, which draws our officers back into the station, and I think undoubtedly has had an impact on the positive outcome rate that we spoke about earlier. There has been a little bit of give on that, and we'll wait and see what the impact has been in the next 6 months, but it's still a very, very onerous process for policing. And on top of that, we also have a national reporting requirement that's been introduced in respect of compliance to those changes, adding more audit requirement and more assurance and compliance, which means, again, more back office work for us in order to maintain that crime standard assurance and file assurance. Nevertheless, our performance is strong in CJS. The introduction of the DG assessments and the national delivery data dashboards has brought increased focus, as I've just said, and that dashboard is actually accessible to the public via the government website. So those listening to this meeting either now or later can go in there and see the national and force comparisons. Our position has improved since the measures were first introduced. At the beginning, we were one of the lowest performing forces in the country, and we are now 8th in the country with compliance rate showing just under 67% against a national average of 52, nearly 53%. So really strong performance and actually improving all of the time. I ought to say, on top of all of that, not only has it added the burden, but actually we are seeing the evidential and file quality requirements of submissions to the CPS becoming more and more complex, which is taking more and more time again for our officers to get used to that, and it again holds them in the office. We know that the criminal justice system is still in recovery from COVID. We know the Magistrates Court and the Crown Court still have significant backlogs. And the barrister strikes have also impacted upon the availability of the judiciary and the courts, and staffing numbers therein have also been difficult. So those backlogs have been persistently difficult to overcome, and they are impacting upon delivering justice for our victims, as cases are taking sometimes 2 to 3 years to come to court, and the victim care teams, both on the PCC side and the police side, are working very, very hard to keep our victims and witnesses up to date and to keep them on board and make sure that they still go ahead with the prosecutions when we get there, even if it's going to take us years to get to court in some cases. Adding to all of this is the CPS are also struggling with their recruitment. So when I spoke to Regional Director a couple of weeks ago, I think they were sitting on 24 vacancies for lawyers. So actually getting decisions turned around in a timely fashion is very difficult at the moment, but we'll keep working with the CPS and hopefully we'll see that improving in the near future, because their recruitment programme is well underway and they have got plans in place to address that. In terms of our custody, that was inspected by HMICFRS in the summer, and the full inspection report is available to the public. There were 2 recommendations and an action plan has been put in place to address those. The main one really around recording use of force and the rationale. So that was around why we were taking things away like laces and ligature elements without appropriate risk assessments behind them. So that is being looked at and we continue to work on that. In terms of the coming few months, the main national changes that are coming is the pre-charge bail legislation that I've spoken about. There's a victims bill being passed through Parliament early in 2023, which will put an increased focus on keeping victims central to decision making. And there'll be again a range of performance measures that will be introduced to increase transparency and hold criminal justice agencies to account for the decisions and the activity and progress that we're making with all of our cases. We've already spoken about out of court disposals, but the 2-tier process comes into play in April next year. We think may get pushed back. But as I mentioned, a huge amount of work has gone on around this to make sure that Lincolnshire is ready and that we've got dedicated staff ready for that implementation. And then we've also got digital case files coming in, being introduced nationally. That's currently in testing. I think we're in a good place for that one. There's been a little bit of realignment, or there will be a bit of realignment of resources to make sure that the manual checking and file build is reduced. But it will come with some challenges, and we should be able, but we're confident we can fully embed it within our existing systems with a little bit of training and appropriate communication. So in summary, it's been a significant period of change for our criminal justice teams, not just because of the G4S transition, but because of the East Midlands Criminal Justice wind up and moving to a partnership with Leicestershire. We'll continue to work along with Leicestershire to make sure that's delivered. It has brought some increased workloads in some areas. In other areas, we are seeing some reductions because of some of those national changes that are coming, and we will continue to look to make sure that we're as efficient as we possibly can be across the criminal justice world, and make sure that we are pushing for that justice that we spoke about earlier, and making sure our victims, witnesses are looked after throughout that process. And I think that concludes that paper.
Thanks very much for that. Not very much to add here. Is there already an overarching plan for implementing the changes in legislation, or is that something that it will come a little bit later? I'm just conscious that obviously we'll know what's likely to be there, but until it gets assent, we can't be certain. But it's, you know, we need to be working on that ahead of time. So I just didn't know where that featured.
Yeah, no, so that's already been worked on. So Becky Talbot-Young alongside Superintendent Liz Rogers are working through that and what this means to us. Very, very similar to the 2-tier out of court disposals. that has been a bit of a moving feast, but we were well prepared for that and are well prepared for that. So we'll keep looking at what those bills are saying. We will realign, and actually some of the proposals that Becky Talbot-Young's put forward in priority based budgeting have been about getting ready for what that future looks like, particularly around where we've currently got people on fixed term contracts and whether they should be full-time posts, because we know this work is coming. So we just got to keep an eye on what might change and what the shape of that might look like once it goes through royal assent and through the two houses.
No, it'll make sense. With regard to the witness care work, how do witness care work with the services that provide victim care, just to make sure that victims have that latest sort of position, you know, so that they can be kept informed?
Yeah, so they're well tied in. I went to probably a month or so ago now that I went and sat down with the team and asked the same question. So there's daily communication going on between them. They are sharing case papers and talking to each other, and actually they're picking up almost jointly the witness and the victim elements of it. I think the difficulty we have in this field is at that point they were saying, and I think our own performance figures, so this was the anecdotal evidence coming back from the team, was they're probably dealing with 3 times more victims and witnesses than we were doing pre-COVID because of these backlogs. So maintaining the contact is really difficult because we haven't actually increased the teams there. They're just picking up more work. And unless those, because actually we're dealing with what should be a temporary rise in demand. So unless we start to see those backlogs in the court cases coming down, the pressure on those teams remains very, very high. But they do work phenomenally hard, and they do talk to each other very daily and make sure that they're linking in and looking after. And actually, I don't think we're seeing, and Julia might correct me on this from a performance point of view, I don't think we're seeing cases being discontinued frequently because of witnesses and victims dropping out. I think we're managing to make sure people are still supportive all the way through, even if it takes us a couple of years to get there.
That's good to hear. Good to hear. We do have an out-of-court disposal scrutiny group who have been sort of established for quite a good while, and the outcomes from that have been very positive in supporting the out-of-court process, just to make sure that we're getting the decision making right. We're getting some really good quality learning from that. It's not met since the summer, sort of June, July time. Are there plans to reinstate that? And I didn't know whether we've got any dates yet, but it just seems like quite a long time if we wait until April for the new system.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. Julia may. What I do know, and I think we covered this in a previous public assurance meeting, was because we knew we were going to be moving to the 2-tier system, we actually put a pause on quite a lot of the work around out of court disposal, which I then reversed. This was prior to Julia joining, I think. So I reversed that on the basis we can't sit on this for a year waiting for something new to come in and not use the existing system. So I think that scrutiny panel may have been postponed, put on hold whilst the new system came in place, and maybe just hasn't been picked up again since. So Julia, I don't know whether you know what's happened to it.
No, sorry, I've got nothing further to add than that, other than to say that I will go and ask the question and just make sure we are reviewing those cases, because I think the value is there, as you've said, the value is there, even though we're going to be changing the system.
Yeah, thanks for that. That'd be good. But yeah, I haven't got any more questions on that one. No, so we'll move on to the final one then, onto the fraud and scams piece.
I think, yeah, Di is going to pick this one up.
Yep, I've got this one. Thank you very much. So earlier when I spoke, when I talked about the JSNA, I talked about the fact that deprivation was linked to increase in perpetrators and victims. I think this is an area that is an outlier in that. And actually what we know in terms of fraud is that it affects all demographics, all age groups, all backgrounds. So Consequently, this is an area that we focus on within the Safer Lincolnshire Partnership, and we also have a significant focus on within Lincolnshire Police around how we support vulnerable victims and how we prevent. So just in terms of the work we've done over the last period, so we obviously have developed networks on the regional and national level, and we've got a lot of engagement in our partnership activity around fraud prevention. We have a Trading Standards Fraud Protect Intervention Officer who actually works within our police team, and what that does is allows us to work with people who struggle to believe that they have been victim of a scam, because we get a number of victims of scams that actually don't believe that and therefore continue to send money to these individuals. So we've got some work ongoing around that. Operation Revive is our volunteer fraud protect team, which has been rebranded. Now, this is a really fantastic opportunity where our volunteers support the community in this area, which we know affects many people. What we've done is we've refocused their efforts to focus solely on fraud prevention as opposed to other offence types, so that we can hone their skills and knowledge in this particular area and hopefully then give a even better service to those victims of fraud. One of the things that we're trying to do is encourage victims to get back out in the community. Obviously, there's been a long period of isolation through the COVID lockdowns, and just trying to encourage people to get back out into their communities to try and reduce that feeling of isolation and actually give them that courage of strength to challenge some of the attempts of these scams. We just looking at kind of where we are at the moment. So since January, we've received over 4,000 action fraud reports. Now, what's important to remember is this is only those victims that actually report the fraud. We know that this is underreported. We know there is a lot more fraud than ever gets reported. But of those reports, we've managed to identify just under 500 of those were high-risk victims. And so each of those victims have received a visit either by a neighbourhood policing officer or one of the fraud protect team, and been given some form of intervention. So we're actively going out to engage with and support those victims that we consider to be high risk. And in addition to that, we've identified another just under 600 medium risk victims. So we've made sure that alongside the fraud booklet that we've sent to raise their knowledge around fraud, that they've had some additional communication from our teams just around how to understand it and to try and prevent it. Because we now have the victims on our systems, it does make it that much easier to then start to identify repeat victims and try and build up that picture as to whether somebody does require intervention. That will also impact on their perceived risk level as well. The next point I want to talk about was the call blockers. So we managed through a variety of streams to get a number of call blocker devices to provide to victims to prevent scam calls. Now, we know at the moment that there are only 34 currently deployed in victims' properties, and these are fantastic pieces of equipment, and we know that through the month of September nearly 500 scam calls were blocked. So they do have a definite worth. Now, we know that we haven't got the numbers deployed that we would like to have deployed, and I think there is a number of challenges with that in terms of making sure that we get the devices out to areas and make sure that the training is there for our neighbourhood PCSOs and police officers to install the equipment and give the right advice. So we're working through that training and making sure that we can do that. One of the other myths that we've got is that some people are worried that if they have one of these devices, it will block their friends from calling and increase their isolation. So we're trying to work through those issues as well to make sure that we can get as many of those devices out there to block those calls as we can. The other area I want to talk about is the Fraud Protect Engagement Officer. So we've obviously invested in this resource, and what that officer does is raises awareness around different fraud types, different groups. So I know of recent we've done inputs to Adult Social Care, Victim Links and Age UK, and also does groups out in the community, just to continuously raise awareness. And we're trying to focus on the high harm areas of fraud, where we know that the most monetary loss is suffered, and that's around courier fraud, which is a bit of a strange title for it, but actually that's those frauds where people call up impersonating either a police officer, HMRC, banks, and trying to get people to elicit their bank details and get money that way. Investment fraud, we know, is a significant one at the moment, and also romance fraud. So we're trying to target the awareness and prevention around those. So moving forward, we're going to be looking at evaluating the impacts of the work we're doing with Op Revive around supporting those more vulnerable people, to see if, and also the those individuals that have had the benefit of the call blockers, to see what changes that's led to, and if that's influenced their behaviour and their kind of challenge to some of those issues. We're also working with the university students to try and make sure that the language we're using is right, because it's all good and well us putting out prevention campaigns, but we need to make sure that we're doing it in a way that people are understanding, that we're able to target different demographics in the right way, because obviously, as I said earlier, this cuts across all demographics, so we need to make sure we've got targeted interventions for each of those different demographics. And obviously our engagement officer will continue to do the work with community hubs and hold those surgeries across the county to increase that awareness. We recognise that obviously cost of living crisis, there's going to be more vulnerability there, and obviously we're concerned about the desire that people might get involved in cryptocurrency scams or pyramid schemes to try and relieve some of that. So we're trying to raise awareness around some of those issues as well. And I think the other important thing to say is, before I wrap up, is just that, as I've said, it targets everybody. So it doesn't matter whether you perceive to have vulnerabilities or not. Fraudsters are very sophisticated. It doesn't matter how educated you are or how prepared you think you are. Everybody needs to be aware, and I think the message to any of the members of the public that are watching this is to focus on that Take 5 campaign. So if they are asked for money details, whatever that might be, or something that seems too good to be true, that they actually take the time to not take that instant decision, talk it through with friends and family, and just actually double check and do their research to make sure that it is genuine. So I think it's just that advice to everybody, that actually this doesn't matter who you are, this will target everybody. So I'll pause there if there's any further questions.
Thank you very much. That was really good. A lot of the questions I've got, I've been ticking them off as you've been talking, which is always great. I mean, it is an area that I personally get concerned about, because there isn't a part of our community that is immune to this, whether they're old, whether they're young, whether they own a business, whether they you know, work in a business. Everybody is vulnerable and susceptible, and literally, whether it's an email, a phone call, whatever it is, they just need to catch you at that moment when you're thinking about something else or whatever. It's a numbers game, isn't it? For a lot of them, they'll put out that much information that they literally just need a handful of people to come back, and it's very, very hard to combat. And I think it's one of those areas, like so many others, that we cannot enforce our way out of. It's got to be education driven, and it's always difficult when you are dealing with different age groups around education, because the messaging, as you pointed out, has got to be very different. So in the same way we teach our children to be safe when they walk to the park, we need to teach them to be safe when they're online, and that's as much from obviously predatory individuals in the fraud space as it is from any number of other spaces that we want to keep our young people safe from. It's quite difficult to have those same conversations, you know, with somebody that's in their 80s, for example. My mum goes online, it's brilliant, because she's able to connect with friends and family, the local choir, whatever it is. But I've now got her to the point where she will if she's not sure, she waits, she checks with me and whatever. Not everybody's in that fortunate position where they have somebody that's down the road to check, and it is really important that we sort of get those education elements out there. So obviously working with Op Revive, again, they do tremendous work, we know, but it's we've had some very successful campaigns of getting fraud and scam packs out across the county to people that wanted them. I think it was around 10,000 of those we successfully gave out to people that wanted them, and we will run a similar campaign in conjunction with yourselves in the near future. But this time I'll give my office some warning that I'm going to do it. Last time I just suddenly decided we should do more and put out some messages across social media. Unfortunately, the office then had to sort of quickly get into gear to provide the packs and everything else. I'll give them notice. That's my promise to the team. I won't just suddenly wake up and decide to tell the world to contact us. But I think it is really important to get out ahead of some of those challenges. The call blocker one's an interesting one because we invested quite a lot of money from here in that, and we leveraged in a lot of money from national trading standards around that, and a lot of credit to my former deputy police and crime commissioner Stuart Tweedle, who sort of led the charge for that. And I seem to remember there's at least 70 of those high-end call blockers somewhere, so it would be useful to obviously understand, do we know where the majority of them are? Because I accept that obviously some will go out and then they don't all come back, but making sure that we've got them, because they're quite expensive pieces of kit, and like you say, we want to make sure they are targeting the right people, but equally they do nobody any good sat on a shelf. So if there is anything else we can do to help get them to the right people, then obviously we want to support you in your endeavours with that. 'Cause it's you know, it's crime prevention. Kit sat on a shelf is one of those things that I know none of us want, if it can be doing some good, but I fully accept the challenges that you've alluded to. Just a quick question, which is around the definition you use around high risk, medium risk, low risk. If you could just expand on that a little bit for me, that'd be really helpful.
Yeah, well, I think that basically links to the value of the fraud, the isolation of the victim, and any other vulnerability factors that are there. It will vary, and when we do threat, risk and harm assessments on any crimes coming in, we will take into account whether somebody's been a repeat victim as well. So I think it's a multitude of those factors.
And we're confident that the system will pick up that somebody's a repeat victim, and then does something additional kick in at that point?
Yeah, so obviously we get all of the reports in and we assess all of those action fraud reports to understand and kind of risk assess. So we will pick up whether somebody is a repeat victim, and that will then link into that risk assessment when that comes in. So because we hold all that data, we can then factor that into that risk assessment.
Okay. No, that's all good. You've answered my other questions on that, so I'm not going to labour the point. I think it's a really important area of work. When we talk about public trust and confidence, fraud is one of those areas that I think nationally is a real problem. All too often I hear national messaging around crime is falling, in brackets, except fraud. And I'm not sure that it's reasonable to put certain crime types in brackets and exclude them from the crime figures. It is crime, and actually your average member of the public is likely to not experience lots of crime, especially in Lincolnshire, I'm glad to say, but fraud and scams are probably the area they're most likely to encounter that kind of activity, and it isn't great national messaging, I don't think, when we exclude the very crime type most people are likely to encounter, and I don't think that that's our way of dealing with it. I think we've got some really good work going on around this area of business, and I'm hopeful that we can build that, and especially in the partnership space, because again, as we know, education, prevention is the only place really where we can have a chance of dealing with this. And we will come out of that space where we have analog parents with digital children, and we'll start having digital parents with digital children, and suddenly it makes it a whole lot easier, because I think there has been a generational thing where children can run rings around the parents when it comes to what security measures they have on their devices and everything else, and that's going to be that sort of bit of a lag in that, and that's made it easier to target some people. But I think we'll come out the other side of that naturally. Okay, any other questions before we wrap things up? Wonderful. So on that then, there is no other business that we need to go through today. Just remains for me to say thank you very much for attending, and we will obviously meet into the future. And Aubrey, next meeting is?
It's on the 8th of March.
8th of March, so we'll be almost Easter. There we are. So have a good Christmas, everybody, and we'll join again in the new year. Thank you.
Thank you.